So my name is Greg Edge, and as Dan said, I work for Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry, and I'm one of 3 state silviculturist forest ecologists. And you may ask, what is silviculture? What's a silviculturist? And I'll tell you, my wife of 32 years probably could not answer that question. She'd just say, he works in the woods, he talks to other people and foresters and trees. So I will give you the skinny on what silviculture is. So silviculture is the practice of controlling forest composition, so what species are growing in this plant community, controlling the structure, so how are those plants all arranged, and also the growth, which is just the growth. And we do this to maintain or enhance the forests for any purpose, and that's really critical. A forester like John over there, he could be managing this forest for high quality oak timber, but just as easily he might be managing an oak savanna for rare plant species. So it's all about the science behind managing forest systems. And I'll say this about silviculture, it's similar to real estate in the way that real estate says it's about location, location, location. Silviculture is about context, context, context. And by that I mean it's the context of the site you're dealing with. So we have all different kinds of site qualities and productivities. We have different species compositions. So all of those sites are going to have different options for management. It's the context of the landowner objectives. So if I talk to each of you individually, you'd have maybe some slightly different management objectives for your property. And we try to choose silviculture that works with those objectives. And then it's the context of the landscape. And this is the one we're not very good about, but your forest is part of a larger landscape. So we want to think about how does that fit into that landscape? What is it providing from a wildlife standpoint, for example? Is it something that fits into that context? Does it provide something unique? But that is another aspect that we want to think about with the silviculture that we choose. And because these are all these variables and we're dealing with natural systems, you can ask me any question and there will be one answer that is always correct. What is that answer? It depends. John knows it. That is always the correct answer because we're dealing with these natural systems and these multitude of factors. And so we're trying to balance all of that context. And we don't understand everything about these forests. We understand portions of it. And I don't know if we'll ever understand all of it. So we're just trying to make calculated decisions based on what we know. And silviculture has brought along lots of techniques and options and knowledge literally over centuries, which I think is a really cool aspect to silviculture. So we have silvicultural treatments and practices that we use that are hundreds of years old, that have been brought over from places like Europe that we brought to this country. And then we have silviculture practices that we developed last year. So it's this whole breadth and this changing field and science that makes it really exciting and really interesting to work with. And so what we're going to do today is just really quick crash course in the silviculture of 3 different forest types that we're standing at the intersection of right here. We're going to talk about the silviculture of aspen. We're going to talk a little bit about the silviculture of oak forest. And then we're going to talk about the silviculture of this forest, which is transitioning to what foresters might call northern hardwoods, or more or less maple, basswood, ash, those types of shade-loving species. And the silviculture we choose in each of those is going to vary, and it's going to be based on 2 major things. One is the biology of those tree species, or what we call the silvics of the tree species. Each of these species has a different biology in terms of how it grows, how it germinates, how it regenerates itself. We have to match that. And we're also trying to match the natural disturbance environment that that species thrives in. So each of these has a natural disturbance, what we call regime or environment, where it would have grown. Aspen would have grown in a larger scale disturbance. Think about a moderate to large windstorm that blows down a forest, or a larger scale fire. And its biology matches that, and we're going to talk about that. Oak is going to fit in with a natural disturbance of kind of low to moderate understory disturbance, and that would have been fire historically. And northern hardwoods would be more adapted to small scale disturbances that make small openings or disturbances in the forest, like small wind events or even just individual trees dying. And silviculture is going to try to work with and mimic those disturbances to grow what we want to grow. So let's talk a little bit about aspen. If you want to grow aspen in your forest, and again, think about that context on whether it's an important species on your property. Here in southern Wisconsin, I would say we have more scattered aspen. It's not across the whole landscape. So sometimes landowners are trying to keep that on their property because it's just a unique element. There are some wildlife benefits we'll talk about there. In northern Wisconsin, I believe 18% of the state's forest land is now in aspen and birch, and 75% of it is in northern Wisconsin. And that's just because of the history we have in Wisconsin. We went through a period of large cutover in northern Wisconsin where they harvested lots of that land. They also tried to convert portions of it to agriculture. They decided that didn't work so well. They abandoned it, and all of that high levels of disturbance were perfect avenues for aspen to come into. And now, if you look at the inventory across the state for the last 2 decades, you'll see aspen is kind of going down, down, down. And that's just natural because those northern forests are naturally succeeding to other types without major disturbance. But there's other areas where we're focusing on keeping that aspen and birch and trying to put those disturbances on the ground because we want those early successional forests. But for you here in southern Wisconsin, it's more likely going to be sporadic. This was a small stand of aspen. This side of the road is 5 acres, I believe you said, Dan. It was harvested in 1980, so it's 42 years old, and their goal was to regenerate aspen. And think again about what's the disturbance. Aspen is adapted to a high level of disturbance. And that's because it regenerates or regrows in 2 ways. It can grow from seed, really light, fine, that cottony seed that flies in the spring, has to land on bare mineral soil, so it doesn't always get those conditions, but it more commonly regenerates from sprouting, or what we call coppice. Coppice is just a fancy word for sprouting. It could be root sprouting or stump sprouting, but aspen root sprouts. And what stimulates those root sprouts is warmth. And so when an area of aspen gets blown down or gets harvested, the sun warms that soil. I think it has to get to around 70 degrees, and that stimulates dormant buds along those root systems to shoot back. And they shoot up vigorously. It's not uncommon to have aspen stands that are regenerating to have 10, 20,000 stems to the acre. I mean, that's like every 2 feet apart. Over time, those sprouts or saplings will begin to compete with each other. They'll start to shade each other out, so they'll start to self-thin. And you'll see those young aspen sapling stands, you know, with aspen falling down like matchsticks in different directions. They're just self-thinning. So by the time you get to this stage, there's many fewer trees within that stand. Sometimes in silviculture we do thin aspen if it's really good site, but usually we don't. We just kind of allow that natural thinning to occur. And And so to get to that open sunny condition, you've got to create large openings. Generally speaking, you need openings that I would say are half to an acre in size or larger to get that full sun. Actually, an acre size opening in the forest will generally have full sun conditions only at the very center of that opening. So that's why we need those kind of size openings. We also have to get sunlight to the ground, so everything is getting cut. So you might refer to seeing an aspen cut as a clear cut because everything is clear felled to get to that condition. Silviculturist, forester, will call that a coppice harvest. So now I want you all to use that term, coppice harvest, and you'll be technically correct. These species, and there are three major aspen species: big-tooth aspen, which that's this, quaking aspen, oftentimes grows in conjunction with big-tooth aspen, not always, but the two can grow together in uplands. And we have also a balsam poplar, which is kind of a wetland forest aspen species. It's not as widespread as these other two. They're relatively short-lived species, so you're looking at species that grow 80 to 90 years old max. You can get individual trees that might go 100, but that's rare. Usually 80 to 90 on good sites, that'll be kind of the end of the life cycle. So these are 42. They're really growing nicely right now, super vigorous. They're like 70, 80 feet high, so really nice growth within these.
And both sides of the road were cut.
Yeah.
On that north edge there too, the height on it.
Foresters will harvest these on what we call a rotation, and that's just the length of time that we allow this stand to grow before we think of regenerating it. So the time you start a forest over at year 0 to the time you regenerate it is called the rotation. And what rotation you choose is going to be based on the species. So we know this one maxes out at 80 to 90 years, and also the objectives, the landowner objectives for the property. For aspen, it generally falls between 35 years and about 80 years. It's a pretty wide window, but your objectives are going to determine, and your site capability is going to determine when that rotation is. Big tooth grows pretty vigorously. So this is doing quite well and can generally be carried later. It's 42 right now. I don't know when the school forest might think about regenerating, but you could think about it in another 10 years, or it could go a little longer. So it's going to depend on what the school wants to do. So just think about that aspect of it. If you're
The very first harvest that was done on the school forest. The first commercial harvest, right here.
So you picked a really aesthetically challenging harvest type, Dan, on the, the first harvest, because that's sometimes what landowners have a harder time with, because that clear felling is part of that operation. You can alleviate some of that aesthetics and also add to wildlife benefit by including some retention within those harvests. So sometimes we leave, and I believe there are some older oaks that were left in that, or leave islands, what we call aggregate green tree retention, so just little islands. And that can help break up the aesthetics and also add a different structural element that is beneficial. There's a very rare songbird called golden wing warbler, and it actually keys in on these young regenerating aspen stands that typically have some oak retention within them, so some scattered oak trees. And there's actually about 47 species of songbird that key in on these young early successional forests. So they are an important component, as well as kind of the common species that people tend to think about: grouse and woodcock and deer. Those species use these aspen stands at all various stages, from the young thick stems where the broods go and escape predators, to aspen of this size where grouse will start to feed on the flower buds of those trees. So just kind of really unique and ubiquitous tree for Wisconsin, and has a very common management or silvicultural system that we employ to grow it. It's fairly straightforward. Before we move over to the oak, is there any questions? Okay, I just wanted to bring you over here. You've walked through this. It's kind of a nice example, really good quality red oak with some white oak mixed in stand. The school forest, Dan tells me, has thinned this stand twice over their school forest history. So they've taken out sort of a lot of the kind of maple growth that's underneath. They've thinned around some of the nicer trees so it has more of an open appearance. But it's oak dominated now. And oak, I can't emphasize this enough, oak is a really critical species here in Wisconsin, in many different places, both from a timber standpoint. It's one of our highest value timber species, but also from a wildlife standpoint that rely on the acorns, bird species that rely on the insects that key in on the oak flower buds. There's a whole system and a whole ecology around oak that is really critical. And the challenge for us is it's not regrowing everywhere. And that has to do with, again, that biology of the tree and the natural disturbances that would have kept this on the landscape. If you're on a dry, sandy, deep, well-drained sand like over by Nakusa or Rapids, you probably can't get rid of your oak. It grows everywhere because there's less competition on those sites. We develop oak seedlings just naturally in the understory of those stands. The oak isn't as nice a quality as here, but it grows very easily, and we can harvest that and regenerate it quite easily. We're sitting here on what I would call a dry mesic site, so it's not the richest, moistest sites, what we call mesic. It's not the driest, it's somewhere in between, but it grows really nice oak, and it has a little less competition than the real rich sites, so it has a great opportunity to manage for oak. So what's the silviculture we would use? Let's think about the biology of the tree. We know it's adapted to fire, and one of its adaptations is that it keeps its growing points below ground. So when it germinates as an acorn, it has what's called, fancy word, hypogeal germination. It keeps the growing points of that stem and that acorn at or below ground level. And so if a fire comes along and burns that off, it has growing points to just shoot right back. Species like maple are hypergeal, so they'll have their growing points above ground. And if a fire burns that off, it will also damage those growing dormant buds. And so it does not sprout back as readily. So historically, multiple fires would have favored oak species over things like maple and basswood. And you would have developed what we call an open forest system, more park-like, more sun penetrating the canopy, not much of that understory or mid-story layer of maple that blocks a lot of that sunlight. And that would have given us the right light conditions for oak germination. We know through research that an oak seedling needs at least 20% direct sunlight in order to put on height growth, so to be vigorous and actually grow in height. Lower than that, they will fade. They won't be able to photosynthesize enough to keep themselves going. So if you have dense mid-story or low shade like this maple, you walk in there, you'll be hard pressed to find a lot of oak seedlings, I would imagine, because that shade level is just too high and they can't exist. So the fire would have done that for us. It also would have gotten rid of leaf layer, would have exposed mineral soil for acorns to fall on, and you would have developed this layer of regeneration, what foresters call advanced regeneration, which is critical before the overstory either dies or blows over or is harvested in order to replace those oak trees. So how can we manage this in silviculture today? Well, we can use prescribed fire, so we can put fire back into the system just like it was originally designed. And we're doing that in places, but we also know that not everyone has the capacity or the willingness to use fire, and we're not going to see that across the landscape. So foresters also use other techniques to mimic that fire. If you walk over to Clark County over here, you might find them doing scarification with a dozer and a blade, where they go through and they root spring, they uproot some of these maple saplings, they expose soil that way, they get rid of that low shade. They might, ironwood, they might do that in conjunction with what they call a shelterwood technique. A shelterwood is simply manipulating that overstory, making it somewhat more open, maybe removing 40 or 50% of that to allow partial shade in. So you're creating that open forest system that fire would have ultimately done, and mimicking that disturbance. You develop advanced oak regeneration, and once you get that established, then they can harvest the other oak and release and regenerate that stand. And that's a really critical element, is you need to have this stuff growing on the ground before you take away the seed that produced them. And if you think about this, you may be thinking, geez, that's quite a process. And that's exactly right. So foresters like to say that oak management is a process and not an event. It's thinking about all of those needs all the way along and developing that advanced regeneration to replace those stands, and using those silvicultural techniques that we've developed to do that.
You like to say that you really got to start thinking about that oak harvest process 10 to 15 years before
Yep.
you're starting to think about harvesting your trees.
Yep. Yeah, it's a 5, 10, 15-year process to really do it correctly. The answer also depends comes in here, because it's going to depend. If you're on a farm over in the Central Sands, it's much easier. You probably already have advanced oak regeneration. Not a problem.
And if you don't have a big deer problem, you might actually have oak seedlings in here you can put.
Yeah, a dry music site, and if you didn't have much deer, even these thinnings like the school forest has done may stimulate that advanced regeneration.
Some landowners on the central Wisconsin lands are trying to figure out how to stop the oak. They want to
Yeah.
go mine. They don't want the oak back.
Yeah.
And they're fighting us.
It- oh, there you go. Oh yeah. And if you're in the
There's the scarlet.
if you're in the rich silt loams down by John, then it becomes real tricky, because everything wants to grow down there. Somebody in the last group mentioned their issue with ferns, and sometimes on those north and east slopes here we have very dense fern layers. The deer kind of contribute because they don't eat the fern, and that grows. So you got the tanager on the video?
I didn't get the
Bill?
tangent, no.
Come on!
Something shiny. I'll get distracted.
So the whole silviculture of oak management could be a workshop, multi-day workshop in itself. But I guess what I want to leave you with is, with all of these species, think about the biology, learn a little bit about the biology of the species, what it needs to grow, and then we choose silvicultural techniques that match that biology or that silvics of those species. And this was just a really nice comparison about two species that have two different strategies that our silviculture tries to match those two different strategies.
I always found it interesting when Dan was prescribing that there was a cut like the oak gets a little bit down in the road here, and even like the processor using the steel tracks every time they spin.
Yeah, to scarify.
I was like, wow, I never would have even thought of that.
Mhm.
To get that soil loosened up as they move through.
Yeah. And adding to that process, we didn't talk about it, but acorn crops are a whole interesting thing too. So every year is not a great acorn crop. Oak have bumper crops. For red oak, it's like every 3 to 5 years. For white oak, it's every like 6 or 7 years. And so those bumper crop years are really important from a forest standpoint. And if you can time those type of activities that causes that disturbance with those kind of bumper crop years, that's when we see really good oak regeneration. That's not always easy to do. Easier said than done, but it's just another element to consider in managing oak systems. And I'd just like to encourage all of you that have oak on your property is to think about trying to sustain at least some of it on the property, because it is such an important species. Even if you're on a richer site and you can't do everything, even small areas, I think, add a really nice long-term wildlife element to it. And we know from a climate standpoint that oak are adapted to warmer, drier conditions and are projected to be much better adapted to future conditions than certain other species we have.
What we found is even on our mesic sites, if we can have a harvest when we do know there's some oak regeneration, and then follow that up with some management practices to encourage those few seedlings that are
Yes.
out there, we can have a big influence on maintaining an oak component
That's
on the landscape without prescribed fire, without these other things, but we're gonna have oak on that landscape.
Yeah, that's a great point, John, and I wish you would have been in the first group, because I forgot about kind of that whole follow-up practice. So especially on the rich sites, once you get some oak on the site, it's not a guarantee it's going to make it up to the canopy. And so some type of release activity where you're thinning around those, making sure that oak component actually recruits up there is really valuable, and it's something we haven't nearly, in my opinion, focused on enough in the past. Okay, I just wanted to bring you here to this last site. School Forest did a neat thing. Since they're about education, they coppice harvest this aspen on this side, but this side they left alone. So there was a comparison of, to study for the students. And it's a good comparison in what we call succession, or the movement, the gradual transition of one plant community to another. And this, since this is 42 years old, right? We determined it was 42 years old, that this probably makes this about 80 or 90 years. And remember, we talked about what's the biological lifespan. I'll let these folks go through. No problem. The biological lifespan for a lot of these aspen is 80 to 90 years. And if you look in here, you can see aspen dropping out of the stand. So you see the standing dead snags the woodpeckers are working at. Yeah, so it'll develop fungal growth that will just speed that process. Sometimes you'll see them break off at those fungal conchs.
Decay, most of them.
But what do you think this forest left alone will become? It's a quiz question. No, just what is it gonna, what species is it gonna? No, it won't, probably won't grow aspen, because that needs that full sunlight condition. What's growing underneath this right now? What do you see? Yeah, so there's a lot of red maple in there. There's some basswood in there. There's a little sugar maple in there. Probably grows a little better red maple on this site than sugar maple, Dan.
Yeah.
There's some,
Maple is king.
yeah, there's some dandy red maples over there.
What's the difference between red maple and
Well, it's considered the soft maple, and sugar maple is considered the hard maple, but from an ID standpoint, probably there you go. The leaves are the easiest, so red maple is just going to have a V between this lobe, and a sugar maple is going to have a rounded lobe. So once you have leaves, that's an easy diagnostic.
So the
Okay.
red maple has the serrated points, and the sugar maple is more lobed like that.
You also
maples are my favorite trees, so I never needed.
once you look at enough of them too, there's a distinct bark difference. And red maple, especially as it gets older, it's going to be a grayer bark. It's going to get a little shaggier. And so you can start to tell by looking at the trunks.
Thank you.
But you're exactly right. This is succeeding to what foresters might categorize as northern hardwoods, which is kind of maple, basswood, ash type of forest. Although this one has a little different mix because we're on a bit drier. You actually even have some white pine in here as well. And so over time, this natural succession will continue. The aspen will drop out fairly rapidly. These maples will get sunlight in those openings and they'll start to grow and they'll fill in that canopy, and that succession will occur within the stand. And you may want that as part of your objective. You can actually speed that process if you wish that to be part of your objective too. And from a silviculture technique standpoint, if that was the objective, we're going to think about the biology again, right? We're going to think about shade-loving trees adapted to smaller disturbances, small-scale wind disturbances, and we may start harvesting aspen, but we'll keep those openings maybe a half acre or less for sure in size, probably smaller than a quarter in size. Keep the maple basswood saplings and allow that regeneration to fill those small openings. That will simply speed that natural conversion process, we call it, to a northern hardwood forest, if that's your objective. And the neat thing about silviculture is you can start getting creative too. We talked about white pine being on this site. You could look at this and go, this site will actually also grow white pine. I could start making some little larger openings where there's white pine and releasing those, or even planting them and getting a mixed stand of both hardwoods with a conifer component. And that actually adds a really unique wildlife structural element to a forest. There are species that key in on that, what we call conifer component within a hardwood stand. Foresters have this really complicated term to refer to those now called mixed wood. I don't know where that one came from, but that's what we're calling it now. So you can adapt those silvicultural techniques and start to get creative to meet various objectives within that stand. So I just think, Dan, you picked out a great site. I think just like it has, 3 different comparisons where you would use 3 relatively distinct silvicultural systems. And we only had to walk 30 yards, so.
And on the back side of the hill, there's a clear cut, an acre, 2 acres, 3 acres, Dan?
Yeah.
3 acres of
Probably.
aspen on the back side of the hill that you can see a 3-year-old clear cut. And then 2007 clear cut,
Down the trail.
down the trail of it, so you can see this 07.
Progression.
Okay.
It's just, wow.
I was looking for a young one. I brought my shovel along. I just wanted to dig up a root runner because it's really cool. Sometimes, like on the young ones, you can see how many sprouts come out of a root system. And I don't know if I mentioned this to this group. I don't know. What group is this? 8, 9 now? But actually, a lot of these aspen grow in clones. They're one vegetative organism. And the largest organism in the world is actually an aspen clone in Utah, they've determined. I don't know how they determined that. But it's huge, and it has lots of biomass above ground and below ground in one giant clone. It's a kind of interesting trivia topic. So
Thanks, Greg.
you're welcome.